Good morning, everyone. On behalf of FERDI, CERDI, University of Oxford, and our partners, it is a pleasure for me to welcome you to this international conference on the Scramble for critical minerals. My name is Alou Adessé Dama. I'm a researcher at FERDI. It is for me a great pleasure to serve as your facilitator throughout this conference. Over the next 2 days, we will explore one of the most strategic questions of our time: how the global race for critical minerals is reshaping geopolitics, industrial policy, and development trajectories around the world. These minerals power the green transitions: electric vehicles, batteries, digital technologies, renewable energy systems. They sit at the crossroad of geopolitical competition, strategic dependency, and global supply reconfiguration. For resource-rich countries, especially in Africa, but one may think of Latin America, Asia, even Europe with Ukraine, this context presents both a historic opportunity and a major challenge. How can producing countries move from exporting raw materials to becoming key players in value creation, processing, and industrial transformation? How can they negotiate better deals, design smarter fiscal regimes, and build stronger institutions so that this new scramble does not reproduce the inequities of the past? These are among the questions that will guide our discussions. FERDI is delighted to host some of the leading researchers and practitioners on these topics. We are genuinely happy to bring together economists, policymakers, private sector representatives, geopolitical analysts, and development experts to shed light on the economic, environmental, and political drivers of the competition for critical minerals. And of course, to draw lessons for sustainable and inclusive developments. I want to thank all the speakers and participants for joining us. My role will be to ensure smooth transition. Fancy word for keeping us on time. Couple things about me. I'm a man of few words, and I like to smile a lot. So session chairs will probably see this smile quite often. But just one small thing. My smile will be inversely proportional to the remaining time of each session. At the beginning, you will see a big and friendly smile. As time goes by, the smile will decrease slightly. And if I remember anything from my theater classes, I will even try to fake a tear or two for those not respecting their time. So without further ado, let us begin our opening remarks. We are very grateful to have distinguished speakers for the opening remarks. Patrick Guillaumont, Professor of Economics and founding president of FERDI, as I like to call him, the rock star of development economics in Francophone Africa. Patrick has shaped decades of research on development economics, vulnerability, and the least developed countries. His intellectual leadership continues to be central to global debates on development. He has trained many ministers, former ministers of many African developing countries. Thank you for your service, Patrick. Simone Bertoli, Professor of Economics and Director of CERDI at the University of Clermont-Auvergne. Simone is a brilliant mind and a dedicated researcher. His work spans migration economics, development, and labor mobility. He plays a key role in strengthening the collaboration between FERDI, CERDI, and international research network. Christopher Adam, Professor of Development Economics at the University of Oxford. Christopher is a leading voice in macroeconomics for low-income countries, particularly of sub-Saharan African countries. His research is influential for understanding the challenges faced by resource-rich countries. Christopher is also a fellow in economics at St. Cross College of Oxford, a research associate at the Center for the Study of African Economies, and a fellow of the European Development Network. He also held several editorial positions, including with the Journal of Development Economics, and the Oxford Bulletin of Economics and Statistics. And finally, for the opening session, Rick van der Ploeg, Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford, CPR and CECIFO Research Fellow. Rick is internationally recognized for his work on environmental economics, natural resource management, and macroeconomic aspects of natural wealth, making his presence particularly relevant for our focus on critical minerals. Thank you all for being with us. I now invite Professor Guillaumont to begin the opening remarks.
Bon. Bonjour tout le monde. Dear all, dear friends, I am obliged to speak in English, even if I do prefer to speak French. But here it will be an exception in my usual activities. With Alou, we have a very protocolar introduction, but I should like to speak very spontaneously and to give to this meeting some kind of fluency and friendship, because all of you are, most of you are new in this place of Clermont and FERDI, but some others are very close to our activities and very old friends. It's a very welcome event, and I am very glad to open this conference. I had some difficulty to arrive to Clermont. It's my place, but it has been a long way to go. A long way to go to this conference, Rabat. But it's a wonderful event, thanks to you. Thanks to your involvement in the preparation of this conference and with cooperation with Frederick, and so I also acknowledge this strong preparation for that. Rabat, you are directeur de recherche au CNRS, au CERDI, et senior fellow at the FERDI. And you have worked a lot for this conference and for this program of FERDI on management, domestic and international management of resources. And you have published, because everybody should have that in mind, and there are copies for everybody. Climate change, natural resource, and geopolitics. It's a wonderful collection of essays he has produced during these last 2 years. This project has been finalized by a FERDI team led by Audrey-Anne, who has done a long and very important work with Rabat, helped by Bulboud and Emily, and all the team of FERDI has been mobilized for that. And I hope it will be very lively and convenient and comfortable, even if the weather coming from Oxford maybe is not the most interesting weather we have in France. But we have snow. You don't have snow in Oxford. I refer to Oxford because this conference for us is a wonderful opportunity to renew, maybe revigorate the links with Oxford. In fact, it has been still alive, but I should refer that it has been beginning more than 40 years ago, and it has been brought mainly by Paul, Sir Paul. Welcome, thanks to be here. And it has been very lively cooperation during years and years. You, Paul, you, Chris, with Jan Gunning, have been professor invité at CERDI during, I don't know how many years, but every year you were coming, Paul and Jan, another time Chris, and it was very influential on the training of our students and researchers. And I should remember that, because it has been very, very important in the development of FERDI. And during this period, I joined Jan because when, Paul, you were director of research at the World Bank, Jan was in Oxford in charge of the Center of Study on African Economies. And it has been for us, we have a very impressive development. I remember the first time you came, I said, oh, I should like to set up in Oxford a small CERDI. And afterwards, we are very, the CERDI is still very small compared to what you have done in Oxford. And the cooperation has been very fruitful for us. And this cooperation was, in particular, in some of the papers, we had the benefit, Sylviane and moi, to write with Paul, Jan, and Chris on some issues we are discussing presently now. It was on the management of commodities. It was on aid conditionality. We published some papers, not fully influential, I should say, but a little. But it's a lesson of the life when you become that you should accept to have ideas launched which are not immediately influential, but after some years it may become so. And I recall that because the topic of the critical materials we discussed these 2 days should be enlightened by the lessons of the work you have done, Paul, Jan, at Oxford, on the trade shocks, the books on trade shocks and the lesson. And what is interesting to consider is that how, to what extent the issue of the critical materials are different or more special case of the commodity issues you have so well analyzed in the past. And I am sure, reading the draft of the paper of Paul, that I found that, you will see today, I don't want to say what he will say better than I can do, that the lessons he draws are lessons for critical materials, but can be extended to the other resources. And in fact, these minerals are critical today, but they may not be critical tomorrow. And I should say it is as for the tradable in international and macroeconomic analysis, there is not a fixed category. A good is tradable or mineral is critical, not forever, because it depends on geolocalization, but of geopolitical as well for minerals, and political issues and macroeconomic policy for the tradable. And there is, this comparison may be artificial, but it is not, because there is a link between the tradability of the goods and of the minerals. And since we talk about the tradables, it could lead us to some other aspects of the management of the critical mineral related to exchange rate policy as well. So it was noted in the concept note and in the works of Rabat, the critical minerals raise many, many problems in various fields, social, political, and macroeconomic management as well. And some of the lessons which will be drawn, I hope, from these wonderful issues could be used and analyzed furthermore for other resources. So thank you for being here. I have to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Ibrahim Assar, who came from Dakar, especially for this meeting. And he is the Director General of the most important enterprise on extraction of phosphate in Senegal, a long experience of these issues, as well as some other practitioners who are here, and we should be thankful for their presence here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm glad to welcome all of you here again. I'm Simone Bertoli, Director of CERDI, and I just want to say a few words about our research center, which is a joint research center of the local university, Université Clermont-Auvergne, the CNRS, the French National Research Council, and the IRD, Institute for Research and Development. Sorry, I'm moving. We currently have around 40 faculties and as many PhD students coming from all over the world and mostly from African countries, French-speaking, mostly African countries. I'm really glad to be one of the organizing institutions of this event, thanks to Rabat, as Patrick was saying. Our research center was established almost 50 years ago. We're going to celebrate our 50 years next year by Patrick and Sylvain, who are both in this room, and our focus has been always, and it still is, on development economics. This conference on the Scramble for critical minerals, I think, is a typical case of what we study. When I was in my PhD years, so more than 20 years ago, unfortunately, the professor who was in charge of the PhD program in development economics in Florence, Giovanni Andrea Cornia, who also used to come to Clermont-Ferrand, told us that development economics is the economics of bad luck, is the economics of shocks. So then, and the title that Rabat have chosen for this conference, the Scramble for critical minerals, is reminiscent of another scramble more than 1 century ago, the Scramble for Africa. So this is certainly a challenge for developing countries, possibly a threat, but we are here to understand under which conditions these can be turned into an opportunity. And I think that this is really a recurring theme in development economics. There are shocks, there are sudden shifts, and how these can be harnessed to foster the development of developing countries rather than constituting a threat. So I think that this is crucial. This is not new, as Patrick was saying, but I think that it's going to be particularly intense in the coming years because the critical nature of these minerals is something that is, to me, as an external reader of this literature, an unprecedented historical challenge. So I welcome all of you for these 2 days in Clermont-Ferrand, and I'm very glad that you are all here to exchange and looking forward to listen to your presentations.
I'll be very quick because I'm conscious that we have 1 minute left before Paul has to talk. So I want to say thank you very much for being here in FERDI and that you've helped so much for getting this off the ground. Particularly Bulbul, I have to thank very much because she did all the powerhouse behind all the work. So we're very grateful to her. The topic is extremely important. We had many people wanted to come and talk here. Over 100 applicants, so you're the selected few. And it's a mix of economists, some political scientists, geologists. So it's a mix, and they also come from different parts of the world. So we did our best to get representatives from Africa, from China, Latin America as well. So in that sense, it's a bit unusual. So it's a disciplinary conference. It's a kind of interregional conference on one of the important topics of our age, namely the scramble minerals. I won't say much, but it's a lot about geopolitics. We tried to get more papers on the geopolitics of minerals. Of course, Europe and maybe the United States of America are many decades behind what's going on in China. So we're very happy to have you here to talk and tell us what's going on in China as well. But I'm not saying that in a flippant way, but it is something like this independence of kind of other countries to be a bit, to kind of have a kind of resource independence is an important question. And then the other big question which will be addressed, hopefully, in the conference, it's not just about getting the stuff out of the ground. It's also about the processing. So countries like Indonesia, for example, have put on an export ban on the export of minerals. And then that led to an increase of processing of the stuff at home, which is from a development perspective great. So we'll ask many of these issues. I myself am very interested in the implications of this for the green transition. Green transition is not so green as we think because the minerals we're talking about, they go together with a lot of environmental issues as well. So we have to talk about these things as well. Anyway, I will talk no longer. I hope we are all in good spirit with each other. We have plenty of breaks. We hope that some of the papers will come out in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. So we hope that we get good comments which make our refereeing process easier as well. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you to Patrick, Sylvain, colleagues at CERDI, FERDI, to Rabat for the organisation, to Bulbul and Audrey for the fantastic organisation that's brought us here so smoothly. Let me just take 1 minute to say my role here is a really enviable one. I'm here to learn, but I'm here wearing the hat of the managing editor of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. And we have joined forces with FERDI and with Rick with a view to publishing an issue of OXREP, as we call it, in the first quarter of next year, early 2026, that will feature a large number, but a selected large number of papers presented in this conference, both from people who are here online and our presenters on Zoom. So we are absolutely thrilled to have this as a special issue of OXREP forthcoming next year. I think it'll be a high impact issue. It'll be an opportunity to get profile for what look like some really fantastic papers that are going to be presented over the next couple of days. So let me just conclude by saying thank you for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conference, and let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you to all speakers. Yeah.
Let me add a word to thank the Review of Oxford to have collaborated for preparing and follow this event. I was concerned previously by the difficulty to have a real influence of the work and the vehicle of the review is very nice and I hope very effective channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. So now we're going to turn to special addresses, which will be chaired by Patrick himself. So, Patrick, the floor is yours.
So, we have the chance to have three marvelous panelists for this first session. I don't want to, there is no need to present Paul. Because Paul, Sir Paul now, as you know, is the most known economist on development and broader issues. He is quite well known here, but all around the world. And it will be too long to present his activities, his many books, influential, sometimes debated, but that's fine. And so everybody knows Paul Collier. Everybody has the chance to read his books and his papers, and his new, I should say, vision of development economics, including in the last book, not only the South country, but the southern part of the North. And this is the global vision, which is more and more interesting. And we'll find this vision in the paper he will be presented just now. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Right. I haven't got long, and there's been quite enough thanking, so I'm going to get started. Underlying the new international concern about critical minerals and rare earths is the belated recognition of a serious security threat from China. Under President Xi, a new style of aggressive international diplomacy has been adopted, using threats of export bans and debt foreclosure as bargaining tools. In response, Europe, the USA, and Japan are all seeking to protect themselves by searching for these minerals in Africa. And that has driven up prices of these minerals, right, creating yet another scramble for Africa. I'm going to argue that beneath the current hype, the scale of the eventual benefits to Africa will depend upon long-term strategic thinking. The immediate benefits in terms of an export bonanza will be modest. Price patterns of minerals suggest that large price increases are seldom sustained. The rents that they generate rapidly get eroded. I'll give you, to save time, I'll just give you one example, which is very material, and that's what's happened in diamonds. It's very important for a number of African countries, most especially Botswana, where it's a disaster. So a few years ago, there was innovation in industrial diamonds. And so the market in industrial diamonds was replaced by synthetic diamonds. That didn't matter for Botswana because it was producing the top-end, very high-quality stuff for the consumer market. Just very recently, the synthetic diamonds at the top-end quality, suitable for jewelry, diamond rings, and that sort of stuff, they have turned out to be a marketing success. The tagline of De Beers, "Diamonds are forever," has now become "Synthetic diamonds are forever." And so that's a complete disaster for Botswana. I'll be returning to Botswana because the management by Botswana leaders over the years has been superb, and it has lessons for everybody. The volumes extracted of critical minerals also look to be modest. They're measured in kilograms. The price of a kilogram can go very high, but if there aren't very many kilograms, you don't get much money. I'm now going to turn to what I mean by strategic thinking. and how African governments might harness the current international moment of interest in critical minerals for long-term strategic benefits. And I'm splitting strategic thinking into 9 different steps. The first step is to gain geological information. So and I very much agreed with Rick van der Ploeg about the need to integrate a sort of geopolitical, political economic perspective together with the geological knowledge, which is a rare combination. Can the current interest in the Scramble search for critical minerals, can that be harnessed to a wider updating of the country's geological map? That's the vital step. If you can improve update the geological map of the country, you don't know what you might discover. But by doing that, the technology of mapping has advanced enormously in recent years. So you need a really up-to-date geological map. The best example internationally is the Canadian regional government of Nova Scotia, which spent $15 million on updating its geological map a few years ago. That was then disseminated internationally, and it attracted enough interest from mining companies that there was $2 billion of mining investment, of geological investment. That in turn led to the discovery of oil. And the revenues from oil transformed Nova Scotia from being one of the poorest regions in Canada to being one of the richest. And so that transformation built on the back of getting more geological information. That's the sort of dramatic thing that could happen in Africa. But even $15 million is a lot to ask of a very budget-constrained African government. And so the place where they need to be able to get money for these updated maps is, of course, international organizations, most obviously the World Bank. And it's very much in the World Bank's interest to provide a lot of this funding for an up-to-date geological map, and then to use it. And the sticking point, as I understand in the World Bank at the moment, is that you're not allowed to use it to develop oil for climate change reasons. That is, to my mind, ridiculous. The carbon emissions are not going to be reduced in the world by forcing Africa to forgo oil. When America is saying drill, baby, drill, when China is opening coal-fired power stations at a rate of, some each month. And so there's a vital geological interest in these updated maps and permitting it to use them for whatever purpose is found, including oil. So that's gaining geological information. Next step in this 9-point process is the sequencing. And the first principle is you don't want to release to get all your geological information at once. And so given the present interest in searching for rare critical minerals in Africa, if the government just released one relatively small area of the country to say, there's the region you can start with, I think you'll still be able to attract bids. The reason being that as you release tracts of land, you then get discoveries and geological information from that, your bargaining position gradually, as a country, gradually improves. Why? Because you start from uncertainty, considerable uncertainty about what is the geology of the country. As you get some information about the geology of one area, as long as it's aligned with expectations, uncertainty goes down. And that reduction in uncertainty improves the bargaining position of the country in subsequent rounds. There'll be more interest. Of course, if you discover, if the information you get from that little area is more favorable than initial expectations, if you actually found something valuable, that turbocharges interest. But even if you discover bad news, that there's nothing there, you've not lost anything. On the contrary, the government has gained valuable information if it discovers as early as possible that it doesn't have any valuable critical minerals, because it then tells it you don't need to build capacities that you won't be able to use. And so you release information, you release areas gradually, that builds up your bargaining power. And as you build up that bargaining power, your position improves. Second point in sequencing, it's vitally important that you get competition between companies for this in bidding, because the companies have far more knowledge of the geological possibilities in the country than the government can possibly have. There is a huge asymmetry of knowledge. So if you can get two companies bidding against each other, they both have this much superior knowledge to the government, and at least some of that value is revealed in their bidding against each other. So generating competition between well-informed companies reveals something which is an approximation of true value. I now want to, so a few words about how to run an auction. Always the devil is in the detail with these strategies. And so auctions, the temptation is to overload the bidding with a lot of different requirements. Conditions on how many jobs are being created, how inclusive is the process, and so on. The basic principle of running a good auction is to limit the number of things specified, and I think limit to two. One thing is how much money is the company bidding. And the second thing is to scrutinize, is this bidder a credible bidder? Does it have the technological expertise and the financial expertise to do what it says it will do? There's a great temptation to include as bidders people who are politically connected and promise the earth, and that's a disaster. It just opens the door to corruption. So, just to summarize, you keep it two dimensions, money and competence. It then gets quite ugly in the geopolitics. One further thing to improve bargaining position is insist on an up-to-date mining code and put the law in which says you've got to follow the provisions, the latest provisions of the mining code. That gets very ugly. You may have followed, at the beginning of this week, Barrick Mining, which is the biggest gold miner in the world, finally conceded to the government of Mali that it would indeed follow the latest law of the mining code, and that that would apply retrospectively to its past deals. Right? The process by which the government of Mali got that promise was pretty ugly, but the fact is, ugly has been used the other way round against Africa for centuries. And so when the boot gets on the other foot, I think I'm very forgiving of what Africa does when it has the opportunity to put the boot in. Let me turn now to the third element, which is taxation of critical minerals and other natural resources. This attempt to capture mining rents is very easy for companies to avoid. The less salubrious companies do so by the simple expedient of bribing public officials. There's plenty of evidence for that. But even the companies which follow the law and don't sink to bribery, it's still incredibly easy to avoid, legally to avoid taxation. An example is profits tax. Profits tax, in an ideal world, the profits tax would be the perfect thing, the perfect instrument. The ideal economic theory world in which everybody behaves impeccably. We don't live in such a world. And so profits taxes are immensely easy to avoid. The company will set up a subsidiary to do business in the country concerned. So if we're going to Botswana, we'd set up a subsidiary. If we go to Guinea, we'd set up a subsidiary. And the company will then borrow from the parent company. It will borrow money at an interest rate, which can be extortionate. It can then buy services from its parent company. So the subsidiary buys services, expertise from the parent. And what price will be paid for those services? It's opaque. It will then sell the resulting ore back to the parent or to another subsidiary of the parent. And again, what is the price being paid for the ore? Well, there isn't a market in the ore because it depends upon the content of the ore. So what you do to protect yourself from all these abuses, you have to really get into the weeds here of specifying what is the maximum interest rate that can be charged, how much debt can be used compared to equity, and build a capacity for testing the content, the mineral content of the ore. These are all special capacities that need to be built, and that's complicated. The basic principle is to try to get to something that is an observable price, a transaction done by a third party. Going back, trying to trace back to third-party transactions. Similarly, safeguarding against corruption on the part of public officials involves transparency in bidding processes and multiple veto powers, so that bribing would have to involve bribing a lot of different people. That said, there is no defense against a corrupt president. If the president of the country is corrupt, there is nothing that other entities can do to offset that. So, moving on from taxation using critical minerals as a pressure point for African debt restructuring. And this is very important. China is keen to protect its African critical mineral deals, while Europe and the United States are keen to overturn some of those past Chinese deals as illegitimate and to get themselves new deals. Now, historically, I should say that Japan has in this case sided with China. Japan's historic view was that as a creditor, it would not forgive loans. And so in the past, Japan has always said, if it's a debt, it has to be paid in full. So that's been the historic Japanese position. If you followed the last week or two, we got a very new, aggressive, right-wing Japanese leader who's very likely, who sees the big enemy as China. Forgive me, delegate from China. And so it's very likely, I think, that the Japanese position on debt forgiveness will shift. And that's very much in Africa's position. It's very much in Africa's interest if it does so. Some of the past Chinese deals really are, I think, illegitimate. A little-known feature of the Chinese deals is that they are all legally enforceable in English courts. Why do the Chinese want them to be enforceable in English courts of law? There are some reasons for saying, well, English courts of law have integrity and all the rest of it. That's not why the Chinese want the case to be heard in English courts. The defining feature of English courts, from the Chinese perspective that is advantageous, is that English courts of law are wildly expensive. Wildly expensive. And that massively advantages a litigant with deep pockets against a litigant that is short of money. And of course, the Chinese companies concerned have very deep pockets, and the African governments they're up against don't. And so the incentive facing African governments is always to try and concede a compromise. So that's just an example. The moment with African debt, I hope you all know this, but there is a crucial ambiguity as to whether those debts are corporate debts by a Chinese company, in which case they should be adjudicated in the London Club process of mutual haircuts for debt restructuring, or whether ultimately they are backed by the Chinese government and therefore should be adjudicated in the Paris Club. And in the Paris Club, the principle is, of course, mutual finding of mutual sharing of losses. The Chinese has successfully so far played on that ambiguity so that it neither gets resolved in the London Club, because the Chinese companies concerned know that if they were to take a haircut on their debt, the chief executive of that company will be jailed. And so the Chinese companies at the London Club basically block any restructuring, any significant restructuring. That stops things going to the Paris Club, and so for years there has been no progress on debt forgiveness. Now, what's the way out of that? What's the way out? I think there is a way out, but no single African government or for that matter, a European government, wants to aggravate China, because with China's new aggressive diplomacy, the Chinese will be really vindictive on that country. And so it needs to be one of the clubs. You could do an African club, like the African Union, appealing to the IMF to say, please, IMF, will you resolve whether these debts should be settled in the Paris Club or in the London Club? Right? So that could be a request by the African Union, or the European Central Bank could do exactly the same thing for appeal from Europe. The European Central Bank is, after all, a club of the European countries, and they've got perfectly legitimate interest in saying to the IMF, this issue needs to be resolved now. It's been stalled for long enough. If it went to the IMF could then make a ruling one way or another. Either yes, it's London Club, or yes, it's Paris Club. Right? I think the obvious thing is to conclude that it should be Paris Club, frankly. Let me pass on from that to using critical mineral leverage as a pressure point, not just for debt forgiveness, which we just covered, but for investment in infrastructure. How am I doing for time? I'm okay? Right. So, beyond debt, African governments need to attract investment in infrastructure. And I'm going to give you the examples, current examples of Guinea and Zambia. Guinea, which is extracting iron ore from its Simone mine, and I think just this week, the first iron ore delivery has rolled down a Chinese-built railway to the port. Now, I have to be careful what I say here, but that railway is jointly owned by a consortium of a big international mining company and the Chinese. And between them, they have, until, if that is the only railway to the coast, they have a complete monopoly on transport of the iron ore. As soon as you hear the word a complete monopoly, as an economist, you should get anxious, because anybody that's got a complete monopoly can extract pretty well all the rents. And that is the situation in Simandou on iron ore at the moment. Fortunately, the Americans have an interest in building a second railway line to the coast. And if the Americans were to build such a second line, it would greatly disadvantage the Chinese and mining company consortium that has the monopoly rights route, but it will be very much in the advantage of Guinea itself. Because once you've got a second line, the competition between them would break that monopoly power. And so there's a huge American interest in building that line. This is what good geopolitical diplomacy on the part of African governments can achieve. Always break the monopolies. So that's an important principle. That's the case of Guinea. Exactly the same is true with Zambia. Zambia, there is a rail line at the moment that the Chinese have built to the Indian Ocean. The Tazam railway of a long time ago, 40 years ago, has been renewed, revived, and it reaches the Indian Ocean coast. And that is a railway line which is an extension of the old Chinese initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, so that resources can flow all the way from China across the Indian Ocean, up the rail line, as far as Central Africa, landlocked Zambia. Again, the Americans are interested in building a second railway line, not to the Indian Ocean, but to the Atlantic coast. And again, there is a huge geopolitical interest for Africa involved in getting that second railway line. It's exactly the same structure of story in Zambia as it is in Guinea, with exactly the same structure, that there is a very strong interest, both in for Africa. Time? So let me press on and ignore that and go straight to a question of using resource revenues. And using resource revenues is an enormously important issue, because the crucial advice here is beware of inflated expectations, which Jim Cust will talk about in a moment. Exaggerated expectations, not just on the part of citizens, but on the part of the IMF. And I want to describe a doom loop. And for this, I want to turn to a little chart, which I hopefully can go up on the screen. Can it go up on the screen? A chart? We'll see if it comes up. Yeah, very good, we got it. So, I'll just tell you a story of Seretse Khama, first president of Botswana, and he introduced it. You'll have heard of narrative economics, Nobel Prize in it, and all that sort of thing. So, Seretse Khama developed a preemptive narrative which said, we're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. That was a narrative which all Botswanans were repeatedly told. We're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. In the Mtwara region of Tanzania, much more recently, there was discovery of offshore gas and riots, people killed in riots, and the mantra of the agitators in Mtwara was, we're rich, we don't have to work anymore. And if you just think, we're poor, we have to carry a heavy load, we're rich, we don't have to work anymore, both halves of that proposition, we're rich, we don't have to work anymore, was preemptively refuted by Seretse Khama. That was him as a communicator in chief. Head of government communicating a narrative which immunized Botswana. It was able to build a massive public investment fund, the Pooler Fund. That was preemptive action. Brilliant. So what is the concept here I'm introducing is investment in investment, building the capacities you need. And we'll start with public investment. And here we've got 5 steps in building the capacity that you need. The design of projects. That's the least important one, because you can, if you want an airport, there are loads of companies that can design you an airport. The selection of projects. The selection of projects cannot be commercially outsourced. It has to be done domestically. The implementation of projects, that's where most of the corruption occurs, is in contracts for procurement. The evaluation of projects. If you never evaluate projects, you never learn. And finally, creating platforms that encourage innovation. Why does all this matter? Because of a point that Sylviane has repeatedly urged, that Africa faces a demographic crisis in the coming years. You have a vast surge in youth population. Either that youth population finds jobs or it makes trouble. And so there's a massive importance in generating jobs, which is that set of processes, combined with the first two private investment processes, because where are the jobs going to come from? They're going to come from the private sector. One process is, and we know worldwide the process. You need banks that are able to fund risky projects so that small firms can scale up, and/or you need venture capital, so that you've got some risk-bearing capital enabling firms to scale up. Africa doesn't have either of these at the moment, and it's vital that it creates them. All of these things can be done objectively or subjectively, and there's a big advantage in it being objectively measured, and that is, there's supposed to be a second one here, never mind, and that is using something called the Public Investment Management Assessment of the World Bank. Public Investment Management Assessment, of the IMF. And the Public Investment Management Assessment rates each of these things objectively. And using that Public Investment Management assessment is the objective measure of whether you're on track or not as a government. I'm out of time, but we've actually finally got a decision tree. I'll just take you through this. Should we put money abroad? Should we put it at home? Always in Africa, you should put money at home for infrastructure, domestic infrastructure. But then you ask, do you have the capacity to invest well? And often the honest answer should be no. Don't pretend. In that case, in the short term, you need a parking fund. You put money abroad temporarily whilst you build these capacities. Even if you, and then as you build the capacities, you bring the money back. So you never need permanent sovereign wealth funds, but you do need temporarily to put money abroad. On that, I really am out of time, so I apologize. Yeah, thank you. I can assure you there is a paper, so if some of what I've said has been too rushed to make sense, when you see the paper, hopefully it will make sense.
Thanks, Paul, for this wonderful presentation. And I had the chance to read the paper yesterday night, and I am sure that everybody will find a great benefit to look at it and go on more deeply on that, because your conclusions are very stimulating, and they may be debated, of course, but I think you have strong apologize for the role of independent groups to have these norms and clear-cut appreciation, evaluation. And there is a role for these institutions such as Oxford, and also it is the conclusion of your, you have no time to say that, but It is written. Thank you so much. I appreciate because yesterday I had a keynote in Tunis and I was 25 minutes and I was cut at the end also. And the next speaker now is not on the floor but on the window. Is John Blundy is maybe on the screen. Oh, yes. John, thank you for being with us. You are a Royal Society research professor at the Department of Earth Sciences, University of Oxford, again. And you are a supernumerary fellow in Earth Sciences. You conduct research into the generation, movement of, and evolution of the magma within Earth using methods drawn from physics, geology, and geochemistry. Your current project, From Volcanoes to Green Mining, investigates how we can use our evolving understanding of magmatic systems to develop new tools for mineral exploration and metal extraction of particular importance given the need for low-carbon economic transition. You have received a number of awards, including the Clerk Medal of the Geochemical Society, and you are quite welcome in this city of Clermont-Ferrand, where we have a broad laboratory on volcanic issues. I don't know whether some people are here in the room. And so, welcome in Clermont-Ferrand through the window, and we are impatient to hear you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very sorry I can't join you in Clermont. As you say, Clermont has a fabulous laboratory of magmas and volcanoes, which I do know, but sadly I haven't been able to visit on this occasion. My presentation is really all about geology, so it's a bit of a departure from the last fascinating presentation, but the word geology will come up just as many times, but perhaps in a slightly different context. So I'll share my screen because I have a presentation here, which I hope you can all see now. Does that work? Yes, okay, great. All right, and I'll put on my, so I'm assuming you can hear me. You'll shout if you can't. So what I plan to do in the next 20 minutes or so is really give you a little bit of a geological perspective on what these critical raw materials are, to give you an idea of how they were formed, what controls their abundance. And then I'm going to conclude with some observations on how we might do this whole mining business in a very different way that circumvents some of the challenges Sir Paul was pointing out and perhaps moves us away from these giant holes in the ground like the one you see in front of you, which is a large copper mine near Salt Lake City. And in the introduction it was pointed out I have a project looking at translating knowledge of volcanoes into green mining, and I'm the director of 2 Oxford programs. One involves Rick van der Ploeg. Actually, they both involve Rick van der Ploeg. One rethinking natural resources, and the other is a multidisciplinary research initiative looking at, natural resources. So when we talk about critical raw materials, there's a temptation to imagine this is the exotica of the periodic table. These are elements that you've barely heard of that have suddenly become important, like rare earth elements. The first thing I'd like to say is that the critical raw materials covers most of the periodic table, and that the critical raw material sine qua non is iron. And iron isn't glamorous, and we all know about iron. It's very critical, and it's about 67% by mass of the demand. And you can put that against something that really is much less abundant, for example, the platinum group elements, that are used for water electrolysis. And there are orders of magnitude difference in both the abundance on Earth and the demand. The next challenge with critical raw materials is which ones are critical rather depends on who you ask. So there are the flags of 9 countries there, and I've looked at their critical raw materials list, and the little table at the top shows the column where all 9 countries agree, 8 countries, and so on. The 5 critical raw materials that all those 9 countries agree on are cobalt, lithium, nickel, rare earths, and scandium. So you see that the target is rather shifting. Iron, for example, only appears on 3 countries' critical list, largely because some of the countries down there produce a lot of iron. And so there's a local variability depending on what you actually have in your own country that determines what constitutes critical. The next thing I want to say is these metals have an enormous range of properties. Hence, they're found in different places. They are concentrated by different processes, and we shouldn't forget that. And finally, what's really remarkable here is that although some of these metals form ores, they actually form minerals that can be mined, some of them are only produced as byproducts, and some of these metals here that are very important, like gallium and germanium, don't even make minerals. There are no minerals containing, as a major constituent, gallium and germanium. So we're entirely reliant on other sources for those metals. So the takeaway here is critical raw materials, that's a really mixed bag. And it's not just the rare earths that demand can be measured in kilograms or what have you. I thought I'd start, a good place to start with any geochemistry is right at the beginning. Sorry, that jumped on. How are these metals made? What is the hand that nature dealt us? Because we can talk about what we would like to use, what's valuable in terms of technology, but we're limited by what was made in the beginning, in the outer reaches of some supernova explosion 4,600 million years ago. And the only point really of this diagram is on the right is the atomic number from hydrogen all the way to uranium on the right. And that's the logarithm of abundance. And obviously hydrogen is the most abundant and uranium the least abundant. And that's really because of these complex nuclear synthetic processes that take place in supernovae. And the other important thing is that you see this remarkable zigzag effect, the Oddo-Harkins effect, which tells us that even elements that are adjacent to each other in the periodic table can differ in abundance by an order of magnitude, depending on whether they have an even or an odd number of protons in the nucleus. So that is the hand that nature dealt us. Pretty much all the rocky planets like Earth, Mars, Venus, and so on, and the meteorites have that composition. What's unusual about the Earth is that 4,600 million years of Earth history has redistributed those elements so they are not uniform. So as a whole, nature gave us a particular abundance of elements, but their local abundance now is very patchy. It's why some countries have resources and some simply don't. And that's largely by a process known as chemical differentiation. And what we see here is the well-known structure of the Earth, a core, a rocky mantle, and an outer crust. Has been a chemical refining process has taken place so that all of the iron-loving elements, such as the platinum group metals, actually end up in the core and on Earth are not really accessible to us. And in a nutshell, that's why people get excited about mining meteorites, because they aren't internally differentiated and they have an abundant supply of the platinum group elements. So on the horizontal axis here, this is the amount of a metal in a meteorite. The vertical axis is the amount of metal in some reservoir. Here's the upper continental crust, the top 20 kilometers or so that we can access. And what you see, that's the one-to-one line. Most elements are a bit richer in the continental crust. Some are very depleted, and here we see the platinum, osmium, ruthenium, gold, and so on. They're all in the Earth's core. Although the average continental crust is enriched, it's not enriched enough to be useful in terms of conventional mining. And so we need these more advanced processes of ore formation. And this diagram on the right shows where the ores sit. They are vastly enriched relative to the starting point of the Earth's composition as represented by meteorites. So those are the ores, that kind of the typical ores that are used for conventional mining exploitation. So the challenge then is to understand what controls the distribution of those ores. Why do some parts of the world have them and other parts don't? And the answer, as you probably know already, is plate tectonics. Plate tectonics has spent 4,600 million years redistributing the elements, endowing some parts of the world with extraordinary riches and depriving other parts of the world, the UK for example, of almost anything of value. And those processes are taking place today. And the most important process of all is actually volcanism. Nearly all, not all, but nearly all of these critical metal resources are associated with modern or ancient volcanoes, which are typically, but not always, associated with plate boundaries. And just as this is a fun fact, it's not really of any great value to us at the moment, you might say, but this is the global cumulative volcanic metal flux of a bunch of different elements, many critical, plotted against the amount that we mine of those elements in the same units. Now, these are metals that are blown out the tailpipe of volcanoes up into the atmosphere. They are frankly inaccessible. All I want to point out is that volcanoes are blowing out their chimney stacks quantitatively about the same amount of metal as we actually mine. And that is an interesting fact. We recover metals from ancient volcanoes, but even today, going about their global volcanic business, volcanic systems are producing a lot of metal. The distribution of ores and critical raw materials around the world is really controlled by the time-integrated effects of plate tectonics in that part of the world. If we look at a map of where critical raw materials come from, they're colored here according to the metals they supply, the big suppliers. And we see, obviously, the primacy of China, Russia, Brazil, North America, Australia, and so on. And there's also some coloring there, depending largely on some ESG considerations. The key point here is a large part of the world is grey. It is not a producer of raw materials. And that is for two reasons. One, nature didn't put that country in the right place in terms of plate tectonics. And that country has not developed the technology to refine metals that come from feedstock in other countries. So although China is dominating, perhaps we could consider the rare earth elements, only 67% of the rare earth production comes from Chinese ore bodies, but over 90% is actually refined. So critical raw material supply is A, do you have it? And B, do you know how to process it? And that combination gives rise to this slightly shocking infographic. Of all the metals I've mentioned in the beginning, there's about 70 or so, 50 to 70 of these. China is the lead producer in just under 50%. So this is all the countries listed for that resource for which they are the lead producer. So China, South Africa, Australia, and Canada, that's about 2/3 of all the critical metals have a lead producer of those four countries. That we could say would be a supply side imbalance. So because I'm talking to a group of economists, I don't know whether you use Sherwood plots these days or whether this is hopelessly outdated, but they're rather fascinating. So what I've done here is I plot the price of the commodity, Shanghai Metal Exchange, London Metal, wherever, against the ore grade. And the ore grade is the horizontal axis, and it's an inverted scale, so it's the reciprocal grade. So this is simply the mass of rock required to get a mass of metal. And there's a value of 1 part per million. That is 1 ton of rock to get 1 gram of metal. And these are critical raw materials in red, critical raw materials that don't have ores in open circles, non-critical, and then non-critical without ores. It's a rather remarkable linear array. I hesitate to call it a correlation, but it's a very strong linear array over 7 orders of magnitude in abundance and 7 orders of magnitude in price. And what that tells us, and of course that was spotted by Sherwood, I guess 70 or 80 years ago, is that the main control on critical raw material price is the energy invested in getting the commodity of interest out of the rock it's in. I'd just like to point out a couple of anomalies here. Cesium and rubidium, these are 2 of the strangest critical raw materials. Their price is controlled entirely by demand side technology. These are very useful elements, but no one wants them, so no one produces them, which makes them very expensive, which means that no one uses them. And in case you're interested, rubidium is used in quantum computing and cesium is used in atomic clocks. They're kind of useful elements, but not a big demand. On the right here, this is the same plot, but I show 2025 prices and grades, 1968 prices and grades, and you can see nothing really has changed in the last 60 years. The grade's gone down a bit. The price, I haven't taken into account inflation, has gone up slightly. By and large, the business of mining, crushing rock to get varying amounts of metal out, has not changed in millennia. And a large part of the present day predicament we find ourselves in is simply that. Crushing up rock to extract metal is almost certainly not the smartest way to do this, and one of the aspirations of the projects I'm involved in is to rethink mining in a slightly smarter way. And I call this disruptive strategies for critical raw material recovery. Imagine now, let's go back to the volcanic system. Let's imagine a volcano where all of the metals are not in a solid form, but they're dissolved in some fluid. Let's call it hot, salty water. And the fact that the fluid's hot means it has some embedded energy. Remarkably, the way we mine is we wait until all that energy's gone and the whole system's cooled down. We wait until all that metal in solution has precipitated, and then we dig a very big hole in the ground and try to undo nature, getting the metal out of the rock and then putting the metal back into solution. And that is a very counterintuitive way of recovering metals. There are ways of getting metals directly out of solutions around volcanoes, or even, as in the case of lithium down here, around salars or areas of natural brines that have become enriched in metals. And this generally is we call mine the brine. It's a very, very disruptive alternative approach, which doesn't involve big pits. The capex is much, much less. It requires some clever materials science to get the metals out of solution, DLE in the case of lithium. And your endowment is most of the periodic table. These fluids contain a little bit of everything. And a little bit's important because the grades are lower, but we have real versatility in terms of evolving technological demand landscape. In case you think I'm sort of making this up, let me give you one really poignant example. This is geothermal systems in New Zealand. New Zealand is not a critical raw material rich country. It has a little bit of oil and gas, it has a little bit of gold, it has an awful lot of geothermal energy. On the North Island, there are a bunch of probably 6 or 7 geothermal power plants shown in red. They're big, 100 megawatts. The fluids that deliver the metal to the power plant, deliver the heat, sorry, to the power plant, have dissolved metals. We know the flow of fluid. We know the concentration of metal. We can work out the flux of metal to each power plant. I've done that for 3 metals here. This is silver, and Rotokawa, that's 57 tons a year of silver, comes to the surface in those fluids that drives the turbines. Tellurium is 70 tons a year, the same power plant. Cesium, Rotokawa is not quite so well endowed, but Tohara, 202 tons a year. Perhaps those numbers are meaningless. Let me put it another way. That is 10% of the global demand of tellurium. That is about 2% of the global demand of cesium, and that, actually maybe 1.5%, and that is about 0.2% of the global demand of silver. What does mercury power in Rotokawa do with those fluids? Does it take the metal out? No. It takes the heat out and it puts the metal back in the ground. And it does that year after year. That's what you might describe as a missed opportunity. In fact, around the world, we can identify fluids, geothermal fluids, and other kinds of what I call saline geofluids that are endowed with metals and unexploited. These could involve those associated with volcanoes, those associated with oil fields. Every oil-producing fluid is around 5 or 6 parts water and 1 part oil. So there's a lot of other fluid that comes out containing metals. Desalination plants, not quite as much metal, but a lot of water goes through there. And then here's geothermal in Kenya. These are low-grade, high-tonnage polymetallic resources. They are globally ubiquitous, much less at the whim of plate tectonics. They're accessible. You just drill into the ground. CapEx is correspondingly less. We can co-recover heat, fossil fuels, or even drinking water in the case of desal. We are valorizing a waste stream, and we are capitalizing on materials science, some innovative ways of extracting metals at low concentration from fluids. And unlike my map showing whereabouts resources come from, all the tiny blue dots there are oil wells. There's quite a lot of them around the world. All of the red symbols are volcanoes. That means hot, salty magmatic fluids. All the yellow triangles are geothermal power plants. This is a global resource that could be recovered without the same potential for monopoly generation as the current way of mining. I'm going to stop there. That's just a very beautiful example of metals that come up with hot fluids. That's Oroki Korako in New Zealand. And you see all the white, that's silica, and all the colored material, different metals coming to the surface and being precipitated. So I hope I've given you a sense that we have to work with the hand that nature dealt us, but we aren't really doing that in the smartest way. There's some real opportunities for innovation here and some ways to rethink our approach to natural resources. Thank you for listening, and sorry again that I couldn't join you.
Thank you, John, for this fascinating link between the thousands of years and the issue of cost. So we have the link between the very, very long-term supply and the short-term evaluation of the cost, and meeting the two is really fascinating. And I wonder whether the volcano in Auvergne should lead in your appreciation of the possibility to have some critical minerals in our neighborhood. We have the lithium, yes, but maybe some other things thanks to your research. Thank you very much. We have to move now to the third speaker. It's Dominic or Mathieu who is speaking from...
Dominic.
Dominic Rohner or Mathieu?
Dominic. No, I will speak today. Mathieu is meeting the director of his ENS Lyon.
Okay, Dominic Rohner is a professor of economics at Geneva Graduate Institute. He's a research fellow of CEPR and several other very distinguished places. He has held a ERC grant on policies for peace, associate editor at the Economic Journal, and many other qualifications. Everybody knows the joint research by Dominic Rohner and Mathieu Couttenier at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, very close from here, but committed to another activity during this morning. And every day we have all in mind. Mine is mine, and you are very leading researchers, both of you, on the link between minerals, not only critical, but critical are in the landscape, minerals and civil conflict. And we are very impatient to hear you precisely on the critical mineral and conflict. Just now, you have the floor, or I should say the window. Very thanks a lot to be here. A little away.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can you hear me well? Yeah, so I mean, I could think hardly of a harder task than to speak after Sir Paul and John. So not easy. One thing that John said at the very end was very fascinating. So I will have a slide on exactly that, on the fact that we need to kind of design mineral exploitation in a way that doesn't create local monopolies. And that the rents are not concentrated. So what John proposed from a natural science point of view of pure geology is very, very close to what actually I would propose from a political economics point of view. So that shows you very much kind of the usefulness of such an interdisciplinary conference as the one today. So let me share my slides. Here we go. So can you see my slide? You can see the slides, right?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, super, very good. Okay, so the piece we wrote with Mathieu is more like a policy roadmap, if you like, on critical minerals and conflict, starting from this literature to which we have contributed. And I've seen that in the conference, of course, there are many people who have played a key role in this literature. So Sir Paul, who spoke today, Michael Ross, and others who are also at the conference. Well, I mean, the world is in a kind of at least twin crisis. Many other crises, I guess, but two crises that are very, very clear, and in my view, maybe the most existential of the threats that humanities face. One is the surge in armed conflict, and the other one is environmental degradation. So in terms of armed conflict, here you have a graph that shows you different types of conflict, going from extra-state, so colonial wars, to interstate wars, to civil wars, and to some mixed forms. And what you see is, sadly, they go up. So we have now more than 50 conflicts around the world, and we've had that for several years now. So it's a sad record. The last time we had a peak was in the 1990s, which was dubbed the end of history. But with the collapse of communism, you had several gruesome wars taking place. but then even that peak was smaller than the peak we have today. So today is like, yeah, a bad phase in terms of peace and stability. And clearly this evolution of conflict going up has been mirrored by other evolutions, things like climate change, and of course the inverse, democracy scores going down. So the moment you have this peak in conflict going up in the last 10 years, that's exactly the moment when you have, when you look at the data of democracy scores, you have democratic backsliding across the world. And here you see also a map of where conflicts take place. For these state-based types of conflict, many of them are in Africa and in Asia. But then, of course, depending on what type of conflict you look at, it then can become more generalized. I can say more about that, but that's just to give you a big picture overview. Now, to come to the second big crisis facing humanity, and that's, of course, climate change and environmental problems in general. And so as you see, that's much wider than climate change. Here you have this methodology of the planetary boundaries. So this graph comes from Markus Lundstedt and co-authors, where you see that the critical planetary boundaries where the Earth is kind of consuming too much or depleting some form of sane boundaries and crossing it, has become worse and worse every year from 2009 to now 2023. So clearly we cannot continue like that, or we will really literally accelerate the car and crash into a wall. So the research question is that we have these twin crises of the environment and of armed conflict, and so is solving them kind of one way to kill two birds with one stone? Do we get a double dividend of tackling one that will help to make the other less catastrophic? Or is it kind of, will the green transition maybe potentially even make conflict risks worse? So will the green transition increase or reduce armed conflict? And then especially in terms of policies, what kind of policies can we put in place in order to have a double dividend, to really kind of kill two birds with one stone and tackle these two challenges jointly in a systemic kind of way? So that's the question I want to ask today. Well, first of all, there are a few, the green energy transition, that it bears opportunities and risks, right? So given that fossil fuel is a major driver of conflict, as you know, been seen in the work of Sir Paul, Michael Ross, and many others here in the room, fossil fuels. So if at some point we need to get out of fossil fuels, I understand that maybe it's better if the US get out of fossil fuels first rather than Africa. So I see the point made by Paul before, but yeah. So the green transition will eventually mean that we will need more sustainable energy and less fossil fuels, and so this will bear opportunities and risks. And so first of all, there are two opportunities that I'll show in the next two slides, and then also a risk. And so the first opportunity is that, well, oil fuels wars. So clearly what we see is that oil has had a very bad impact in terms of civil wars, interstate wars, civilian massacres, corruption, autocracy, all kinds of things. Here I just show a slide of my QJE paper with Caselli Morelli 10 years ago, where you see that constellations of countries having asymmetric oil holdings like Kuwait, Iraq, are very explosive and very, very dangerous because one country may want to attack the other one. But the results are very kind of more general. So, for example, Michael Ross has this book, The Oil Curse, that would give you a very nice overview of all kinds of detrimental effects of oil beyond this particular graph. At the same time, so getting out of fossil fuels will, in principle, be good news for peace, right? Second effect here is that, of course, climate change has also an impact on conflict. And here we have a paper that's forthcoming in Review of Economics and Statistics called Heat and Hate, where basically what we look at is the impact of climate change in ethnically divided places where you have herders and settler groups at the same time in the same little region all across Africa. And what we see there is that in general a temperature shock leads to a substantial increase in the risk of conflict. So 1 degree more would increase conflict risk by something like a third. And that's consistent with work of Ted Miguel from Berkeley and Coulters. However, the effect is very different in places with mixed ethnic groups, while in places where, with respect to places where you don't have these farmer-herder rivalries. And that's what you see in these graphs. So in the first graph to the left, you see the just average temperature to illustrate the data. Second graph, you see the settlement patterns, where in the red zones, that's where we have the mixed settlements, like in the Sahel region. And then in the extreme right graph, what we have is basically a forecast, a quantification of how much we expect conflict risks to go up for the main climate change scenario. And what you see is that the Sahel zone is hit twice. It's hit first because global warming is particularly strong there. So the local warming effects is bigger than in other places. And at the same time, the region has a lot of mixed areas in terms of farmers and herders. And that's why it's not so surprising that these days you have all these political tensions in places like Mali or Niger, for example. And so, now this general climate change effect, of course, to the extent that we now tackle climate change, we have the green transition, we get out of fossil fuels and we move towards more sustainable energy. Well, this second thing will also be attenuated, right? Tackling climate change will help us to reduce these kind of risks that we see here on the graph. Now, this of course comes also at a price, and the price is the increased risk linked to mineral exploitation. And mineral exploitation has a variety of the way critical minerals could potentially fuel conflict are manifold. So first of all, they play a role for financing of conflict. And there we have a piece, we have a paper together with Sir Paul and Anke Höfler, Oxford Economic Papers 2009, on feasibility and conflict. So that's one channel. Then, of course, also the critical minerals are a motivation to fight, as Paul has labeled, for example, greed, the greed effect, a price to appropriate. There is work by Melum and others on that. State capacity gets eroded as well in some configurations where the state gets fragilized, rentier states. You have mining is often capital intensive, especially industrial mining, of course, and you have effects that this can kind of reduce wages. Delbo and Delbo, they have work on that, for example. The grievances effect of people feeling left out, migration dynamics. And then there are also countervailing effects like opportunity cost channel, where if mining is well managed and makes a place richer, then that could also help stability. So you see, it's potentially a double-edged knife. Now, when you look at the data, there is pioneering work on diamonds, and then we also have this paper, This Mine is Mine, that has been mentioned before, 10 minutes ago. And there what we find is that price spikes, the kind of commodity super cycle, with some commodities now becoming really important for mobile phones, etc. These price spikes may explain up to a quarter of civil conflicts in Africa. And so clearly for industrial mining overall, there is this risk potential. And the data is quite clear on that. Now, importantly, this is not a fatality. There are things we can do about it, and that's really important. First of all, in our paper, This Mine is Mine, what we find is that mining transparency and corporate social responsibility can almost completely get rid of this conflict effect. So if you have nice transparency initiatives like the Kimberley Protocol that are more or less well designed, and the firms follow principles of sound corporate social responsibility, the risk is much, much lower than if you have rock firms who don't care about local populations. And then one point that I've made in a short policy piece a few years ago with some quotas is about decentralization. Decentralization of energy production is really important. And that's exactly in line with what John was saying before in the last talk about decentralizing mining extraction. What you want is you want to get rid of a concentration of rents. And think of hydropower in Switzerland, for example, that would kind of, create up to 40% of our energy. Now, we're kind of lucky that we're kind of, 2/3 of the country is mountain and kind of mountain river. So geography has been generous in terms of water. It hasn't been generous in terms of lithium deposits and stuff, but it's easy to do water energy in Switzerland, of course. But what you see is that you have this 40% of energy covered in Switzerland by water energy. But these water plants, they belong to municipalities. So you have like literally thousands of them. And so you have plenty of these plants, and that gives money for the local public finances to build schools and do useful stuff. And so there, if you wanted to grab the cash from water energy from Switzerland, you would have to invade 1,000 municipalities, which is not feasible. It's much easier to invade something very centralized like a huge mine. And so that's why these ideas that John highlighted before are so valuable, also beyond the efficiency in terms of geology, but also in terms of political economics. Then at the same time, related to that, you want something that creates local jobs, where local communities, they get the equal share of the benefits, where you want to avoid local environmental degradation. All of these things would kind of reduce local grievances as well. Yeah, so that's on industrial mining. Then in the piece with Mathieu, we also talk about artisanal mining, where also Mathieu has done some work on that as well. What you see, it's kind of, it's complex. So one particularly, as Rick and et al. Showed, it's especially also the competition between industrial and artisanal mining that creates trouble. Then De La Sierra also explains that in the sense, if you have a weak state, then artisanal mining production can kind of be used as a leverage for kind of rebel governance to kick in and create some kind of rebel states run by warlords. And then also the displacement of miners would also kind of create risks in kind of for recruitment of militias, etc. So artisanal mines are not per se a bad thing. They can have very, very positive effects as well. But it's the context of competition with industrial mining, weak state capacity, that could make it a very dangerous plant. Now, what about international wars, right? So now we're in a period of the comeback, sadly, of interstate wars, and well, you know, in the last 50 years, many of us in the room, we have focused on studying civil wars. Well, just because we want to do statistics, and for statistics you need a big number of observations, and given that 90% of conflicts have been civil wars or internationalized civil wars, well, it was natural to focus on that, because in terms of numbers, there haven't been that many full-blown interstate wars, thankfully. However, the full-blown interstate wars, they are very, very damaging and very lethal and very brutal, as we see in Ukraine, for example, these days. And so now what we see is that multilateral norms of guarantees of sovereign borders are kind of eroding. International governance has become less rules-based in the last years, and now, well, sadly, there is this comeback of interstate wars, and of course the question is, well, how will the scramble for rare for critical minerals play out there? Now, you could think of a variety of causal effects. You could think of the fact that, well, places that are rich in these critical minerals, they would become a bigger target. At the same time, these places may become less aggressive because they have more to lose in a conflict, because they have all these minerals. At the same time, they may become stronger because, of course, with the windfalls, they can buy cash, they can buy arms as well. So you see, if you build a little model, I've built a little model of you know, critical mines and interstate wars. It depends on the parameter values of elasticity, so whether the various Greek letters that you have in your model are small or big, and so it's hard to tell in advance. And then, of course, it's an empirical question. Now, sadly, I'm not aware of so much work that has really pinned this down. We have some work in progress on which we investigate as we speak, but so far in the literature there's not so much that really would pin down the effect of critical mineral on interstate wars in a statistical setting covering you know, big numbers of countries over big numbers of years, and achieving a causal identification. So here what you see is, just to illustrate, for lithium, just one of the many critical minerals. What you see is that well, the reserves are quite concentrated, which is a bit dangerous in some sense, and then the processing is even more concentrated, which is also geoeconomically kind of scary. So clearly it's a topic to be studied more. In the piece we talk a bit about indirect evidence, but yeah, further work is much encouraged. So one of the pieces of indirect evidence we talk about is this paper we've recently we created a working paper recently called Who Wins Wars, joint work with Federle and Schularik. And what we find is that natural resource windfalls make a country militarily stronger. It increases substantially the likelihood of winning interstate war, and it goes through higher military expenditures of a positive windfall shock, higher government revenues, and yeah, so that would speak to the fact that countries become more powerful, if they have these windfalls from critical minerals. Now at the same time, they also become maybe less war prone, because so on the one hand they could become more aggressive in terms of fighting strength, but on the other hand, of course, they have more to lose in a conflict, but they would also become more attractive targets. So again, the net effect is not that clear. What I want to talk about here is modulating factors. And in particular, there are two I want to quickly talk about. How much time do I have left? Yeah, so how much time would I have left?
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay, so I will be brief. So democracy, basically, there's a lot of work that democracy is really good for peace building. I mean, I have a paper with Paul, there are various other papers that would kind of show that democracy, power sharing, all kinds of aspects of democracy are in general really good news for against the risk of civil wars. Now, when it comes to interstate wars, what we see is there is very strong results in the literature, in political science, on the democratic peace result. And what they find is that democracies very rarely only attack other democracies. It's extremely uncommon for a democracy to attack another democracy. You have conflicts between democracies and autocracies, or between two autocracies, but two democracies going to war is extremely unlikely. And so, which means that in order to solve these risks of interstate wars, key prediction would be don't vote for dangerous populists, but go for reasonable parties that don't destroy, that don't hollow out democratic institutions. So these systemic democratic features of the international system is kind of absolutely key. And if there are enough democracies in the system, then typically the mentioned risks are very well contained. And the same for multilateralism, where again we also have a current work in progress project where our preliminary results also find that the kind of strengthening of multilateralism, exploiting exogenous shocks in multilateralism, is something that would very much reduce the risk of interstate conflict. So really we should really go back to an order where democracy is stronger, multilateralism is stronger, and the rule-based international order is stronger. And in that case, we can contain the risks of interstate conflict linked to critical minerals. And as I said before, the risk to critical minerals fueling civil conflict can be contained by things like corporate social responsibility, traceability, and decentralization. So which brings me to the overall conclusion. So the green energy transition is likely to be peace positive as long as worldwide democratic politics and multilateral rule-based order, as well as these international coordination, cooperation, things like social responsibility and traceability are put in place. So it's up to us. If we put in place the right policies, we will manage to kind of tackle these two grand challenges to humanity with one promising policy mix. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dominic, for this wonderful presentation, crossing several issues. And we have no time to have a debate for the address, but I can give a short remark to make the link between these addresses and the following parts. In the presentation of Dominic, as well as that of Paul, we have moved from the issue of mining to the critical minerals, from the critical minerals to the broader issue of mining on governance, peace, and so on. And what is very interesting in the presentation done by Dominic is what is the specific link between mining in general, as it has been broadly researched by Dominic and others, and the specificity of the critical mining. There is a beginning of an answer at the end of his presentation is that critical mining is more linked to interstate because it's more geopolitical. Is it the implicit conclusion? I don't know. But in the following discussion, I think it will be very interesting to look at the specificity of the critical minerals on the different consequences of other mining. Thank you.
Well, now we'll take a short break for coffee, and then we had previously 30 minutes, but let's try to do it in 20 minutes so we can start the next session. Thank you.